Winter was slipping into the edges of Ohio when I turned off the highway and saw the sign for Benton Ridge again. 8 years since I last took that road, 8 years since I walked away from everything I could not fix. The sky was the color of cold steel and the fields stretched out like a place holding its breath, waiting for a man who had run too long to finally come home. I told myself I had no reason to stop, but the truth was sitting heavy behind my ribs, a weight I had carried farther than I meant to. I did not know what I expected to find in that town. Maybe an empty driveway. Maybe silence where voices used to be. Maybe nothing at all. But as the sun dropped behind the bare trees, a thought came quiet and sharp as a nail. If the past was calling me back, it was not for something small. Something waited in that house at the end of the road, something I should have never left behind. And before I even reached the turn, I realized this was not a homecoming. This was a reckoning. The road curved gently toward Benton Ridge as the winter sun slipped behind a line of bare trees. I had been driving for hours, letting the engine hum its steady rhythm while the cold air pressed along the windows. Every mile carried a memory, whether I wanted it or not. The town rose slowly into view, the same grain silos in the distance, the same water tower with the faded lettering that had leaned for as long as I could remember. Nothing had changed, and yet everything inside me felt different. Time does that to a man. It wears him down and sharpens him all at once. I turned onto Emily's Street, a quiet block lined with modest homes built in the 70s. The place looked smaller than it used to. Maybe it was the years I had spent drifting from one job site to another. Maybe it was the distance I had kept between myself and the people who mattered. The driveway came into sight and my stomach tightened. Her house sat with the lights off, even though it was only late afternoon, and the grass had grown tall enough to brush against the bottom of the porch steps. The front door had patches where the paint had split and curled. The blue minivan sat crooked near the garage as if someone had pulled in and stopped halfway through a thought. I got out of the truck and stood for a moment in the thin winter air. The silence of the neighborhood felt familiar. The quiet you only find in small towns where people keep their worries tucked behind closed doors. I walked up the path slowly, my boots brushed dead leaves aside with each step. As I reached the porch, something caught my eye, a framed family picture behind the front window. Emily smiling gently, Derek with his arms stiffly around her shoulders, and a small space on the left where someone might have stood but did not. I knew that space belonged to me. It hit harder than I expected. I knocked before I could talk myself out of it. The door opened almost instantly. Derek stood there with a look that was not quite surprise and not quite welcome. His face had filled out, but his eyes were the same sharp ones from the wedding day eyes that scanned people more out of caution than curiosity. He offered his hand, and I took it. His grip was loose and brief. He asked in a flat voice why I had come without calling. I told him I was passing through. It was the kind of lie men tell when the truth is too long to explain. Emily stepped into view behind him. She looked older, not by years, but by wear. Her hair was tied back like she had been rushing around the house, and there were shadows under her eyes that no amount of sleep could erase. She said my name softly, and I felt something in my chest loosen. When she hugged me, it was careful at first, then desperate in a way she tried to hide. I held her a moment longer than she expected. She whispered that she did not know I was coming, but there was relief in her voice that she did not try to cover. Inside the living room was dim, even though the blinds were barely drawn. The air felt still, like a room that had forgotten laughter. On a small table near the stairs, I noticed a framed drawing from years ago. It was one Emily made when she was 8, a picture of the two of us standing by an old fishing dock. But in this version only, she remained in the center of the frame. My figure had been removed, or perhaps never placed there at all. Someone had switched out the photo. I wondered if Emily knew. She walked toward the kitchen asking if I wanted coffee. Derek stayed behind, close enough that I could feel his eyes on me. Before I followed Emily, a sound rose from beneath the floor. A quick breath pulled in, then silence. I paused. It was not the thump of pipes or the creak of old lumber. It was the unmistakable sound of someone trying not to be heard. Derek noticed me looking down and said the basement was storage. His tone was calm but too smooth, like he had practiced that answer. I nodded and stepped away, but the cold draft that seeped from the gap under the basement door brushed against my ankles. It felt wrong in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. At dinner, I tried to ask gentle questions. Emily answered politely, offering little pieces of her life, but leaving the larger parts untouched. Derek answered for her whenever her voice wavered. Not aggressively, not loudly, just enough to make her fall quiet. I watched the way she held her hands together, how her shoulders tensed whenever he shifted in his chair. People reveal more in slunts than in words. That much I had learned long ago. When the evening settled, I carried my bag upstairs to the guest room. The sheets were clean but cold. From the window I could see the slope of the roof and the faint glow of the street lamp below. Somewhere in the house a floorboard creaked, then another. I lay still and listened. I heard Derek's footsteps moving toward the kitchen, then fading again. After that, only a steady quiet remained. I looked up at the ceiling and watched the fan spin in its uneven rhythm. A part of me wanted to believe everything was fine, that Emily was tired from work and the house simply needed some care. But the cold that drifted from the basement earlier still clung to me, stubborn and steady. Men like me trust their instincts more than their comfort, and something in that house was deeply out of place. I told myself I would stay a few days, just long enough to be sure she was all right. But even as I said it, I knew better. I did not return to Benton Ridge by chance. I came because something had been calling me back. And now that I had walked through the door, the house had shown me its first secret. I closed my eyes and let the silence settle. The night felt long, but it was not the darkness that kept me awake. It was the feeling that somewhere beneath my feet, in a place Derek called storage, the truth was waiting for me, and it was only a matter of time before I opened that door. The house woke before the sun did. It was a soft tremor in the floorboards, the kind that carries through the quiet when a home has too many secrets tucked into its corners. I sat up in the dim light of the guest room and listened. No voices, no footsteps, only the low hum of the furnace drifting through the vents. A cold line of memory ran along my spine, the same cold I had felt the night before near the basement door. I moved through the hallway without turning on the lights. The air on the lower floor held the smell of old coffee and detergent, a familiar domestic scent that could almost convince a man things were ordinary, almost. Outside, a pale morning pressed gently through the blinds. Inside, everything felt paused, as if the house was waiting to see what I would do. I reached the basement door and rested my hand on the knob. It felt colder than anything else in the house. I pushed it open and stepped onto the narrow staircase. The wooden steps creaked under my weight, each sound dropping into the cold air below. It felt like descending into a place no one had cared for in a long time. When I pulled the chain for the light, a weak yellow bulb flickered, struggled, then settled. The sight at the bottom caught the breath in my chest. A small mattress lay near the far wall. A thin blanket was folded on one corner of it, too neatly for a child who slept comfortably. On the mattress sat a boy, his knees pulled up, arms wrapped around them like he was trying to make himself smaller. His head lifted when he heard me. Light touched his face gently, revealing blue eyes that should have held more innocence than fear. He looked at me, not startled, just cautious. I took a slow step toward him. My pulse thudded against my ribs with an insistence that surprised me. Something in me reacted before my mind could. Some instinct I thought I had buried years ago. He whispered his first words without moving much at all. "Mom said you died." The sentence floated in the cold space between us. It carried no accusation, only confusion, a child trying to understand the shape of the world he had been given. My knees bent on their own, and I knelt in front of him, making myself smaller too. I asked his name gently. He hesitated, then said it, barely a breath. "Noah. Noah Harris." The name hit me with quiet force. I had never heard it before yet. It felt as if it had been waiting for me all along. I let my eyes move slowly around the basement. The concrete walls were lined with drawings made in thick, uneven crayon. Figures without faces, some tall, some small, all missing the shape of who they were meant to be. One figure stood alone, its head shaded so darkly the paper beneath had torn. Another drawing showed a small house with heavy lines around the door. None of them showed sunlight. A small book lay near the mattress. A children's storybook bent at the corner like it had been read too many times in the same spot. Next to it was a plastic cup half filled with water. On the blanket I noticed a faint outline of dust, as if it had not been washed in far too long. I asked him how long he had been staying down here. He glanced up at the ceiling instead of answering. His small body tightened when the furnace clicked on. The vibration made a soft rumble through the pipes. He flinched again, almost imperceptibly. I could tell he had learned to read every sound above him the way someone reads approaching footsteps. I reached out my hand, not to touch him, just to let it rest near his. He watched it with the wary stillness of a child who has learned that people can shift moods without warning. Upstairs, a door shut. Footsteps followed, heavy and quick. I stood slowly and turned toward the stairs. The door swung open before I reached it. Derek came down the steps holding a folded spreadsheet in one hand. His voice steady in a way that made the air tighten. "Forgot something for work. Thought I left it down here." He looked past me at the boy. The boy did not move. Derek's eyes narrowed by a fraction, a tightening so slight most people would miss it. But Noah saw it. His shoulders drew inward. Derek walked to the center of the room and nudged the mattress with the side of his shoe, adjusting it by an inch, as if it mattered. He placed a hand lightly on Noah's hair, but the boy's body stiffened. "Kids like quiet," he said, still not looking at me. His hand dropped away. He walked to the stairs and motioned for Noah. The boy didn't stand. Derek's jaw tightened. He didn't speak again. He only gave me a long look, a look full of warning and calculation before heading back upstairs. I stayed still, letting the quiet settle. Then I crouched beside Noah again. I told him softly that I would come back. He gave the smallest nod, but his eyes said more. The fear was still there, deep and old, but behind it was something else, a question, or maybe hope. I rose and climbed the stairs with a heaviness I hadn't felt since the day I buried Sarah. At the top I paused a moment before closing the door. The kitchen smelled faintly of burnt toast. A light snow had begun falling outside, tapping softly against the window. Derek's truck was already gone. Emily was likely still asleep upstairs, unaware of what I had just walked into. I poured a cup of coffee and sat down at the small table. The chair creaked under me. The backyard lay still, dusted with frost, a plastic ball leaning against the fence near a patch of frozen dirt. It was the kind of yard a child should grow up in. Chasing leaves, stomping through mud, laughing under the sun, but the basement had told me a different story. I took a slow sip and let the warmth spread through my chest. It didn't push the cold out. Some cold stays with the man until he does something about it. I set the cup down. The house was quiet again. Too quiet. And somewhere under my feet, in that dim space of drawings and shadows, A little boy was waiting for someone to finally notice he was there. As the snow thickened outside, a soft creak sounded through the floor, the same sound that had woken me before dawn. I looked toward the basement door. The light from the kitchen fell across it in a narrow band, but the space beneath remained dark, the kind of dark that stays even when morning comes. The house carried a heavy stillness that morning, the kind that settles after too many nights of whispered tension. I stood in the hallway outside the guest room, listening to the faint murmur of Derek's voice, drifting through the living room as he argued with someone on the phone. It was a sharp, clipped tone, the kind a man uses when he wants to control the pace of a conversation. When his voice rose, then stretched into a long stream of complaints, I knew he would be occupied for a while. I walked toward the kitchen with slow, steady steps. The air felt thicker there, warmer from the sunlight coming through the window of the sink. Dust floated gently in that beam of light. A small stack of dishes waited beside the faucet. An old ceramic mug Emily had painted when she was 12 sat near the edge of the counter. She had drawn a crooked sunflower on it in bright yellow. Seeing it again made something in my chest tighten. She used to carry that mug everywhere in the house, proud of the way she had painted it, even though the glaze had bubbled. Now it sat forgotten, chipped near the rim. Emily walked in from the hallway, wiping her hands on her jeans as if she had been busy, though nothing around her suggested she had been doing anything at all. Her face looked drawn, eyes tired, shoulders curved inward as if protecting herself from an invisible wind. She froze when she saw me standing there. For a moment I saw the girl she once was, uncertain, wanting to speak but afraid of the shape her words might take. I nodded toward the kitchen table. She came closer, her steps light, cautious. A soft tremble ran through her fingers as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. I asked if she was all right, though I already knew the answer. She said she had been tired, work had been long, things had been stressful. Ordinary explanations delivered in a voice with no strength behind it. Her hands kept moving, straightening a dish towel, lifting a spoon, putting it back down. Movements with no purpose except to fill the space. I reached for the mug with the sunflower and held it up slightly. She glanced at it, then looked away as if the sight of her past life was too sharp now. She swallowed and said she had forgotten it was still there. The lie in her voice was gentle, painful. On the counter near the toaster sat a small bottle of pills. The label had been peeled away and stuck back on the edges, lifting. The cap sat slightly crooked. Emily noticed me looking at it. Her hand moved toward it unthinkingly, as if to shield it from sight. She said quietly that Derek thought it might help her sleep. Her fingers brushed the bottle and trembled. I asked how long she had been taking them. She dropped her gaze to the floor and said she did not remember exactly. Some nights she took one, some nights more. She said Derek kept track, that he wanted her to rest. The words fell from her lips in the practiced rhythm of someone who had told the same story many times, always. To convince someone else, never herself. I stepped closer and asked if she was losing track of her days. Her lips tightened. She nodded once, barely noticeable. There were faint shadows under her eyes, the color of old bruises that had never risen to the skin. I asked about Noah. Her breath caught for a moment. She said he liked quiet spaces. She said the noise upstairs overwhelmed him. She repeated Derek's reasoning almost word for word, but her eyes flickered as she said it, and for the first time I saw the conflict beneath her calm mask. A mother knows when something is wrong, even when she is afraid to name it. I asked her how long he had been sleeping in the basement. She looked toward the hallway again, as if she feared Derek might walk in at any moment. She said she was not sure. She said time had been strange lately. Her voice shrank with each sentence, as if the truth itself was pressing down on her. Then I asked her about the custody papers. Her reaction was immediate. Her breath quickened. Her fingers tightened around the back of the chair. She said she did not remember signing anything that mattered. She remembered her hand, moving across pages one afternoon after her wedding. She thought it was about insurance, or the house, or something she could not quite recall. She remembered feeling lightheaded. She remembered Derek telling her it was routine. The room felt colder then, though the sun still warmed the counter. I took a slow breath, steadying my voice, and told her she could talk to me. She looked up with the eyes of someone who had not heard those words in a long time. She said she was tired. She said life had been harder than she expected. She said Derek had a temper when things did not go his way, but that he was stressed from work. She said all of this with a tremble in her jaw that betrayed the truth she did not name. I asked gently if Noah was safe. Her eyes filled, but no tears fell. She said she hoped so. She said she wanted to believe she was doing the right thing. Then her voice broke on a single word: maybe. The floor creaked in the hallway. Emily stiffened instantly. Her shoulders tensed, her arms drew close to her sides. Her eyes went to the doorway. Seconds later, Derek appeared. He asked if we were having a good conversation. His tone was light but not warm. Emily's voice came out too quickly when she said yes. She stepped aside automatically when he moved closer, as if rehearsed. He placed his hand at the small of her back. The gesture looked gentle. Her body reacted like it was anything but. He glanced at the pill bottle, then at me. A small smile lifted one corner of his mouth, one that never touched his eyes. He said he had to leave for work again. He kissed her cheek. She didn't lean into it. Didn't lean. He walked out the side door, and the silence he left behind was sharper than his presence. When the sound of his truck faded down the street, Emily exhaled like she had been holding her breath for hours. She leaned against the counter. Her hands pressed to her face for a moment before dropping to her sides. I stepped closer and lowered my voice. I told her she was not alone anymore. She nodded slowly, a quiet surrender of strength she no longer had. I could see the girl she once had been fighting beneath the surface, trying to remember who she was before fear taught her to speak softly. That night, after she retreated upstairs, I sat at the small desk in the guest room. The notebook lay open, the paper waiting for the truth. I wrote down every detail, every glance, every tremble in her hands. The sunlight on the chipped mug, the crooked pill bottle, the hesitation in her voice, the weight of her silence. I stopped writing for a long moment and listened. The house settled again with a deep sigh. Somewhere down the hall, a door clicked softly. Far below, the basement seemed to breathe in the dark. I rested my hand on the notebook, feeling its quiet weight, and understood this was no longer just a visit. This was the beginning of something I could not walk away from this time. The house was quiet when I stepped into the hallway. A low hum from the refrigerator drifted through the stillness, the kind of sound that grows louder when a home has held its breath too long. I carried the folder of notes with me as I walked out the side door. The cold air hit my face sharp enough to keep me awake through the long night ahead. By the time the neighborhood settled into sleep, I was sitting in my truck across the street, the engine off and my breath turning to fog on the inside of the windshield. The street lamp flickered at the corner. A dog barked somewhere behind the houses, then the silence rolled back in like a tide. I kept watching the front door. The habit felt familiar, almost like waiting for a freight train to pull into a quiet yard at midnight. You do not know what is coming, but your body stays alert anyway. The minutes stretched slow until a faint light slid across the living room blinds. The door opened a crack and Derek stepped out with his jacket zipped high. He scanned the street before moving down the steps. A small car turned the corner, its headlights dim as if the driver hoped to pass unnoticed. It was an older Toyota dented near the bumper. It stopped at the curb. The man inside stepped out with his shoulders pulled toward his chest. He looked like someone used to apologizing before he even spoke. They met halfway down the sidewalk. The man handed Derek a thick envelope. The exchange was quick but practiced the kind of motion a man repeats until it becomes second nature. Derek slipped the envelope inside his jacket and nodded. They said a few words I could not hear. Then the Toyota drove off, disappearing into the cold. Derek lingered outside for a moment, staring up the street as if he sensed something. I stayed completely still. My heart beat slow and steady the way it always did when a situation turned quiet in the wrong way. After a long minute, he turned and went back inside. I stayed until the house went dark again. The next morning, I headed to the Dollar General in town. The parking lot was half empty. A man wearing a frayed jacket stood beside the same Toyota from last night. He stared at the cracked pavement as he lit a cigarette, his hands shaking slightly even before the cold wind reached him. When I approached, he flinched. I said his name with a calm, steady tone. Mark looked up, startled. For a second he seemed ready to take off, but something in my face must have told him I was not there to accuse him. He asked if Derek had sent me. His voice held a weary dread. I told him no, and something inside him loosened just a little. We stood by his car. The morning wind rustled the plastic bags tangled in the fence behind the store. Mark rubbed his fingers together, a nervous habit. He asked what I wanted. I told him I saw them last night. He swallowed hard and shook his head. Then he started talking in short, broken pieces as if every word cost him something. He said he used to have custody of his son half the week. He said everything changed after a report appeared accusing him of neglect. He told me the accusations were too detailed things that had never happened. He said Derek had been involved in his case. The timing never sat right with him. His eyes held the same kind of guilt I had seen on men who lost their families not through violence but through paperwork. Quiet kinds of losses that eat at a man year after year. He said, do not let him ruin another family. He did not wait for my answer. He climbed into his car and drove away slowly, the exhaust drifting across the asphalt long after the Toyota turned the corner. I stood there for a while, watching the empty space he had left behind. For a brief moment, I wondered if things could have ended that way for me and Emily years ago when grief hollowed us both out. If Sarah had still been alive, she would have found something kind to say about him, something subtle that held the truth without breaking the man. That memory pushed me back into motion. I spent the next 3 nights searching public records in the small pool of lamplight at the guest room desk. The printer clicked and hummed as pages stacked one after another. Derek's name appeared where it should not have. Again and again. Cases scattered across the county. Custody disputes where evidence arrived too late to be challenged. Reports with sudden entries about mothers who seemed unstable or fathers declared irresponsible. Everything matched Mark's story a little too closely. An unease settled under my ribs. It felt like seeing a hairline crack in a steel plate on a winter morning. You know, the cold did not make it appear. It only made the truth visible. Late that third night, I walked downstairs and stood at the top of the basement steps. A thin draft crawled up the stairs. The light buzzed softly when I turned it on. The walls came into view smeared with crayon drawings, faces without detail, bodies without hands, small shadows of fear drawn in colors that should have belonged to childhood instead of nightmares. I stepped inside and took photographs. Slow, quiet, deliberate. The mattress, the blanket, the tiny cup of water, the marks on the baseboard as if small hands had pressed there more often than they should. I aimed the phone at the drawings. Each photo felt like another nail securing the truth I already knew. Halfway through, I paused. A faint sound drifted from upstairs, Soft footsteps across the floor. For a moment I thought someone might be standing outside the kitchen door. The house held its silence too long after that sound. I waited, my breath held just below my throat. Nothing followed. When I finished, I turned off the basement light. The darkness closed in fast, as if it had been waiting. Back in the guest room, I organized the documents into a single folder. The paper felt heavier than it should. I looked at the names on the reports, at the short lines describing families that had been pushed off balance. Mothers' worn, thin children caught between fear and confusion. Lives broken long before anyone realized what had happened. It brought me back to a memory of Sarah. Years ago, she told me that some injustices never shout. They slide into a family quietly through small choices and smaller compromises until one day the damage is too deep to repair. She said the hardest battles a man fights are the ones no one thanks him for. I placed my hand over the folder and let the memory settle. It was the closest thing to strength I had left. When the house finally fell still, I walked to the window. The streetlight cast a hard circle of light on the empty road. The basin of darkness outside the beam looked deeper than it should. Somewhere beneath the floor, Noah slept, tucked away from the world, as if someone hoped he might disappear into the silence. I closed the curtains gently. The night pressed against the glass. I felt the weight of it in my chest, a slow, heavy knot that told me the path forward would not be simple. I set the folder beside the lamp and turned off the light. For a long moment I stood still in the dark, listening to the quiet house, to the faint breath of the winter wind outside, to the echoes of lives that had been altered by the man under this same roof. Then I drew a slow breath and let it settle inside me. Morning would come, and when it did, I would be ready. Morning crept into the guest room in a pale wash of light. I had not slept long. The folder lay on the desk where I had left it, thick with papers that carried more weight than their thin edges suggested. For a moment I stood there and listened to the quiet house, the kind of quiet that shifts after a long night of worry. Then I gathered the file under my arm and headed out before anyone else woke. The air outside smelled of frost and distant wood smoke. I drove to Findlay with the heater humming low. A few trucks passed on the highway, their headlights fading into the early light. By the time I pulled into the parking lot of Sandra Miller's office, the sun had lifted just enough to warm the roof of the building. Sandra greeted me with a firm nod. Her hair was tied back, her glasses resting low on her nose as she gestured for me to sit. She looked at the stack of documents in my hands, then at my face, as if measuring the weight of the moment. She asked if this was everything. I set the folder on her desk and said it was. She opened it slowly, scanning the pages with a focus that left no room for hesitation. Her fingers traced signatures, notes, printed screenshots, and the photographs from the basement. The room felt smaller as she read. A faint whistle of air from the heater was the only sound. She pushed one document aside and held up another. Her voice was quiet when she spoke, but firm enough to anchor the moment. She said the signatures on Emily's financial records had been altered. She said the discrepancies were obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. She tapped the photos of the basement, then the medication notes I had written down. She said CPS was already opening a case based on an anonymous tip and the images they had received. She told me this needed to stay quiet. She said a man like Derek could react fast if he sensed a threat. She explained how quickly accusations could shift in custody situations, how suddenly a narrative could turn against the wrong person. Her eyes held mine as she said it, as if making sure I understood the part that mattered most. I nodded and she leaned back in her chair with a tired breath. When I left her office, the sun had climbed higher. I stood beside my truck for a moment, feeling the warmth on my face. The weight on my shoulders did not lessen, but it settled into place, no longer shifting uncertainly. I drove to Benton Ridge Elementary next. The halls smelled faintly of crayons and disinfectant, the same scent I remembered from years ago when Emily was small and would run up to me with paint on her sleeves. The receptionist led me to a corner of the hallway where a teacher waited, a woman with soft eyes and a steady grip on the folder in her hands. She asked who I was to Noah. When I told her, she nodded gently and motioned for me to follow her to an empty classroom. The chairs were small, the walls lined with drawings and spelling lists. She set the folder on the desk and spoke in a quiet voice, the kind teachers use when discussing a child who has been through too much. She said Noah was polite. She said he rarely spoke unless spoken to. She said he jumped at sudden sounds, even small ones. She described the way he watched other children, not joining them but not looking away either, as if wanting to belong but unsure how to step into the circle. She paused for a long moment before telling me he sometimes stared at the door during class, waiting for something she could not name. I thanked her. She touched my arm lightly before I left, a gesture of shared concern, the kind strangers offer when they see a wound they cannot heal. Later that evening, the house felt warm with the smell of dinner, though no one spoke much. Emily kept to the stove. Derek had not come home yet. Noah sat curled on the couch with a book in his lap, his finger tracing the lines without turning the page. I sat beside him and asked what he was reading. He looked up, studying me with the same cautious eyes he had in the basement. Then he shifted closer and leaned gently against my arm. I picked up the book and read a few lines, my voice low enough not to carry through the house. As I read, I felt the slight weight of him pressing into my side. His breathing slowed, growing severe with each page. It had been a long time since a child had rested against me like that. The last time had been when Emily was small enough to fall asleep in my arms in the middle of a story. The memory settled over me like a warm coat. When Noah whispered that he liked when I read, his voice barely touched the air. But it was enough. Enough to tell me he needed someone steady, someone who would not leave him in the dark, someone who would not mistake fear for misbehavior. I closed the book when he grew too tired to follow the words. He stayed there a moment longer, leaning on me, trusting me in the quiet way children do before they learn to protect themselves. Emily watched us from the kitchen doorway. Her hands were still, her eyes dulled but soft. She gave me a small nod, the kind that carries more gratitude than any spoken thanks. After everyone had gone to bed, I stepped outside for air. The sky was clear. A few stars glimmered faintly above the dark line of trees. I felt the cold seep under my collar. The house behind me creaked in the wind, and for a moment I stood there with the weight of everything pressing down in slow, steady waves. I knew what Sandra had told me. She said Derek could turn the situation in an instant if provoked. She warned me to stay calm, to gather evidence carefully, to avoid any confrontation that might give him a foothold. She said patience was the only shield the law could offer until CPS moved forward. I thought about Emily as a little girl sitting on the porch steps with a Band-Aid on her knee, staring at me as if I could fix anything. I had not lived up to that faith back then. But the world had a strange way of giving a man another chance long after he stopped expecting one. Inside the house, lights were dim. The curtain in the living room swayed slightly from the draft. I walked back in, closing the door gently behind me. Near the staircase, Noah's small backpack rested against the wall. One strap hung loose. The zipper was half open. A single crayon peeked out, blue, the same shade he used for the faceless drawings. I crouched and touched the backpack lightly, not to move it, not to check anything inside, just to feel the smallness of the life I was holding in the balance. Then I stood and turned off the last light. The house settled into darkness and I let the quiet fold around me, knowing the next steps would need to be taken with a kind of strength I had nearly forgotten how to carry. The house had fallen silent long before I closed the last light on the lower floor. Yet something in that silence carried a tremor. It lingered in the corners, in the stairwell, in the thin draft that slid under the kitchen door. I felt it again 2 weeks later, the same uneasy quiet, as if the walls themselves were waiting for something to break. CPS was scheduled to come that afternoon. Sandra had warned me not to say a word to anyone in the house before they arrived. She said these things could collapse if handled with the wrong tone, the wrong timing. I carried those instructions with me every day, still the tension built in the place like humidity before a storm. That morning the sky hung low, gray and heavy. I found myself in the kitchen pouring a cup of coffee I did not intend to drink. The house felt tight. Emily moved through it like someone trying not to disturb a sleeping animal. Noah sat curled in an armchair with his knees drawn close, glancing at the front door every few minutes as if listening for someone's footsteps. Then the front door opened hard enough to rattle the picture frames. Derek's boots hit the floor with the heavy steps of a man walking in angry. His jacket was half-zipped, his face flushed from the cold or from whatever had been brewing in him. He saw me in the kitchen and stopped. His eyes narrowed slowly like he had been waiting for this moment. He asked where I had been that morning. His tone was too sharp for a simple question. I told him I had stepped out for errands. He glanced toward Noah, then back at me, and his jaw tightened. He said I had been spending too much time with his family. He stepped closer. His shoulders squared. He told me I had no right to interfere, that I was only a visitor, that I had already done enough damage years ago when I left. Every word sharpened his expression. I felt the old instinct rise in me, the instinct to back away, to avoid conflict. I pushed it down. I told him calmly that no man had the right to keep a child in a basement. The words came out steady, quiet. There was no threat in my voice, but something made him hesitate. He blinked once, as if the certainty he carried everywhere had slipped for a moment. Then he moved fast, as if the pause had angered him more. His hand twitched forward like he meant to grab me. I didn't move, not out of bravado, but because something at the edge of my vision stopped him cold. On the staircase behind him stood Noah. The boy clung to the railing with one hand. His other hand held onto Emily's sleeve. His small body shook with every breath. His eyes were wide, too wide for a child. He did not speak. He didn't need to. Derek turned and saw him. The anger drained from his face, but nothing soft replaced it. He just froze, as if the presence of his own stepson had short-circuited something inside him. The house went still again. Then a car pulled into the driveway. Another followed behind it. The crunch of gravel under tires cut through the quiet. Emily reached the bottom of the stairs with Noah still clinging to her. She stepped in front of him without thinking. A knock sounded at the door, firm, measured. A woman's voice announced herself from outside. Child Protective Services, another voice followed behind her. Sheriff's office, they asked to come in. Derek let out a low breath. Something between disbelief and panic flickered in his eyes. For a moment he looked like a man searching for an exit, but the hall behind him was too narrow, the presence of the social workers too immediate. I opened the door. 2 CPS workers stepped in. A sheriff's deputy followed, his tone calm as he greeted us. They asked to see the living conditions. Their voices were respectful, but the air of official procedure hovered around them like a weight. Derek tried to speak first. He said everything had been out of proportion. He said Noah liked quiet spaces. He said he had been misunderstood, but his voice stumbled. The sentences tripped over themselves. The social worker asked to see the basement. She followed me down the stairs with a clipboard in her hand. The deputy stayed with Derek and Emily. I flipped the light on. The bulb flickered, then steadied. The cold smell rose from the concrete floor. The worker took in every detail. The mattress, the drawings, the narrowness of the space, the dampness, the fact that the only source of air came from a window too small for a child to reach. Her expression remained neutral, but as she lifted the blanket and felt the thinness of it, her jaw tensed. She asked how many nights Noah slept here. I told her what I knew. She wrote something on her clipboard without looking up. When she joined the others upstairs, she asked Noah if he felt safe here. He didn't answer. He pressed his forehead to Emily's arm. His small body trembled again. That was enough. The deputy straightened. He asked Derek to step aside. He explained that an emergency protective order had been issued based on the evidence received by CPS. The words came slowly, clearly, exactly as the law required. He told Derek he would need to leave the house for a temporary period while the investigation continued. Derek stared at him as if he did not understand the language being spoken. Then his face darkened and he looked at me. Something sharp passed through his eyes. Something like hatred held in place only by the uniform standing between us. He said this was my doing. The deputy stepped forward before he could say more. He guided him toward the door. When it shut behind them, the house sagged with the weight of everything it had carried. Emily sank onto the stairs. Her breath came out in shallow bursts. Noah stayed pressed against her, his arms wrapped tightly around her waist. I knelt beside them, one hand steady on her back, the other brushing a tear from Noah's cheek. The social worker asked a few more questions. She spoke gently, as if her voice alone might keep the fragile balance from breaking. When she finally stepped outside, leaving us in the dim quiet, it felt like the air had changed. A kind of release too soft to be joy, but too real to ignore. I looked at Emily. I looked at Noah. I felt something shift inside me. Not victory, not relief, something quieter. The closing of a distance years in the making. The house creaked. The wind pressed faintly against the windows. Night was settling in. I stood, exhaled slowly, and let the moment rest. The quiet now felt different, as if the walls no longer feared the footsteps they carried. The morning the hearing came, the courthouse rose in front of us like a block of weathered stone that had seen too many families walk through its doors hoping for mercy. The sun had barely lifted. Its pale light ran across the steps and caught the frost on the railing. Emily held Noah's hand tighter than usual. I could feel the tension in her grip when she touched my arm for balance. Inside, the hallways were heavy with the smell of old paper and winter coats. People spoke softly, as if the walls themselves were listening. A clerk guided us toward a small courtroom at the end of the corridor. The door was open just enough for a quiet murmur to slip through. Derek was already seated. His lawyer sat beside him, polished and expensive, the kind of man who never parked his own car. Derek tried to keep his posture straight, but the effort showed in the tight way he held his jaw. When his eyes found mine, there was a flicker of something hollow that passed quickly under whatever anger he tried to mask. Noah pressed closer to me. Emily's shoulders trembled. I placed a hand on her back, a steady touch, nothing more. She exhaled as if she had been holding her breath since we left the house. The judge entered. Everyone rose. The sound of chairs scraping the floor echoed through the room. When we sat, she looked over us with calm eyes that had seen too many people break in front of her bench. Her voice carried the weight of a woman who had spent her life separating truth from noise. Derek's lawyer began with confidence. He spoke of misunderstandings, of stress of a good man pushed too hard. Then he shifted. He hinted that my arrival had destabilized the home. He claimed I had abandoned my family before and that I was repeating the pattern. He held up a psychological evaluation describing me as volatile. Sandra rose. Her tone was measured, almost gentle, but it silenced the room with ease. She asked permission to present a comparison. She laid the report Derek submitted beside another document. She pointed to identical sentences, identical assessments, identical conclusions. She drew the judge's attention to a name on the older file. Mark Ellis. The judge leaned forward. The pages rustled softly. Derek shifted in his seat. His lawyer glanced at him, not with confidence, but with reluctance, the look of a man who sensed the ground slipping. The judge asked Derek where the report had come from. He opened his mouth, closed it, and looked toward the floor. His hands tightened around the edges of the table. Before he could answer, the judge called for a recess. She requested to speak with Noah Pretley. A bailiff led us into a smaller hallway. The air was colder there. Benches lined the wall. A soft hum came from the vending machine at the far end. The clerk knelt and spoke gently to Noah before guiding him toward the judge's office. Emily watched until the door closed. She covered her mouth and whispered that she hoped he would feel safe enough to speak. I rested my hand over hers. Her fingers were ice cold. The minutes stretched. I could hear muffled voices through the wall. They were too faint to understand. My hands settled on my knees. I noticed they were trembling slightly. Not from fear of Derek, but from the weight of knowing that what happened behind that door would decide the shape of a child's future and, in some ways, the shape of my own redemption. A soft click sounded. The door opened again. Noah walked out holding a small piece of tissue tightly in his hand. He looked at us first, then moved straight to Emily. She knelt and wrapped her arms around him. He leaned his forehead against her shoulder. He held me with his other hand, gripping firmly as if he needed both of us to stay upright. We returned to the courtroom. Derek stood near the table now, shoulders lifted in a last attempt at authority. When Emily and Noah walked past, he murmured something under his breath, a plea perhaps, or a command he no longer had the strength to finish. His voice cracked halfway through. Noah did not turn. The judge waited until everyone was seated. Her tone when she spoke had no hesitation. She said the custody would transfer to Emily with me as supervising support. She said Derek's parental rights would be suspended during the investigation. She stated that the forged report and the conditions of the basement would be set to criminal review. The words settled on the room like slow falling snow. Derek's body sagged. Not dramatically, just enough for a man to look as if something inside him had folded. The deputies approached. He gave no protest. His eyes lifted to mine briefly. The anger was gone. In its place was a quiet recognition that control had slipped from his hands forever. When the doors shut behind him, the courtroom exhaled. Emily wiped her face, her breath steadied for the first time in years. Noah stood between us, his hands wrapped around both of ours. His grip was small, warm, and steady. We walked through the hallway together out into the sharp winter air. At the bottom of the courthouse steps, Noah looked up at me. His hand tightened once more. The wind brushed across his hair, lifting a few strands away from his forehead. For a moment, the cold didn't matter. His hand felt warm in mine, warmer than I remembered warmth could be. We stood there a long time before moving toward the car, the three of us held together by something fragile and newly formed. His hand felt warm in mine, warmer than I remembered warmth could be, even with the wind still cutting across the courthouse steps. We walked to the car in a quiet that did not feel empty anymore. It felt earned. Emily kept one arm around Noah as if she was relearning the shape of safety, and Noah did not let go of me until we reached the door. I drove us back through Benton Ridge with the heater running low, the town slipping past the windows in soft gray bands. Storefronts waking up, a barber flipping the sign to open, a woman carrying a bag of groceries, as if the day had never held a courtroom inside it. The house looked different when we returned. Not cleaner, not brighter, just different. The air inside no longer felt held tight. It moved the way air should move in a home. Emily set her purse on the kitchen chair and stood still for a moment, listening to the absence of Derek's footsteps. Noah drifted toward the living room window and watched the street, then turned back to us as if he expected someone to tell him what came next. I told him he did not have to go downstairs anymore. He nodded once, slow, like he was trying to believe it without waking a bad dream. We did not stay in Benton Ridge past the weekend. Sandra advised it was better to change the ground under our feet to put distance between Noah and that basement while the case moved forward. Emily agreed in the quiet way she did now, not because she had no voice, but because she was learning to use it again. I offered my place outside Findlay, the old cedar house Sarah and I bought when Emily was still in middle school. The place had been empty most of these years, not abandoned, just waiting in a way houses sometimes do, waiting for a family to return and decide they still belong to each other. The drive out there was longer than it used to feel. Cornfields lay flat and brown on both sides of the road. The sky was a pale winter blue, thin and clean. Noah sat in the back seat with a small backpack on his lap. He watched the passing trucks and the distant grain silos with a quiet focus that reminded me of Emily at his age. Emily rested her forehead against the window, eyes open, taking in the land, as if it might teach her something she had forgotten. When we pulled into the gravel driveway, the house stood the same as always, weathered and solid. Sarah's rose beds along the front porch were bare now, but the trellises still leaned in their familiar angles. The porch steps creaked under our boots. Noah paused at the door, unsure, then stepped inside behind Emily. The smell of old wood and cold fireplaces met us, mixed with a faint trace of dust. It was the smell of a home that had been quiet too long, but it was still a home. The first night was simple. We unpacked what little they had brought. I lit the furnace and watched the vents breathe warm air through the rooms. Emily cooked boxed mac and cheese because she said she could not remember the last time she had cooked without someone hovering behind her. Noah ate slowly, looking around the table as if measuring the distance between danger and normal. After dinner, we moved through the rooms together, deciding which one would be his. He chose the small bedroom that faced the backyard, the one with a wide window that caught the morning sun. The next morning, we went to the hardware store for paint and a new bed frame. Noah walked between us in the aisles, fingers brushing over boxes of doorknobs and light switches, fascinated by ordinary things. He asked if he could have a lamp at his bed. I told him yes. He picked a simple one with a soft amber shade. Emily watched him choose with a look that was part relief, part grief at how long he had gone without being allowed to choose anything at all. Back at the house, we set the bed together. Noah held screws in his small palm like they were treasures. I showed him how to line the frame up, how to tighten the bolts without stripping them. He smiled a little when he got it right. We hung a map of the United States on his wall, the kind with rail lines traced across it. He traced the long routes with his finger while I told him where trains used to run when I worked for Union Pacific. He listened like a boy watching a world open, not a boy waiting for a door to close. Later that afternoon, he found a framed photograph on the mantel, Sarah in her garden hat, dirt on her cheek, laughing at something outside the frame. He held the picture carefully and looked up at me. He asked if she knew about him. His voice was small but steady. I told him she would have loved him. I told him she would have argued over which bedtime stories to read and which cookies were best. I told him she had a way of making a house feel like it could forgive you for being tired. He nodded, and for a moment his eyes glassed over, not with panic, but with something softer. He set the picture back and left it facing outward. Emily started therapy the following week. The clinic was in Findlay, a modest brick building beside a dentist and a dry cleaner. I drove her the first time. She sat in the passenger seat with her hands folded, breathing slow like a woman stepping onto a bridge that had once collapsed beneath her. When she came out an hour later, she did not say much. She only asked if we could stop for coffee. I agreed. We sat in a small diner off Route 68 and she stirred her cup until the cream disappeared. Her shoulders were still tense, but there was a different kind of tired in her now. The tired that follows truth, not fear. While Emily rebuilt her footing, I kept my days steady for Noah. Breakfast, school, homework, a walk in the yard before sunset. At first he flinched at sudden sounds, at the bark of the neighbor's deed, at the slam of a car door down the road. I never told him to stop being afraid. I just stayed near him. That was the only language children like him trusted. One evening after a light snow, he asked if we could read again. We sat on the couch with a blanket over our legs. I read slowly. He leaned against my shoulder the way he had before, only this time his breathing stayed even. When the chapter ended, he did not move right away. He stayed there as if the world had finally become quiet enough to rest in. He looked up at me, then eyes steady. He asked if I was going to leave again. No question mark in his voice, only a fear that had learned to live inside statements. I pulled him closer. I told him I was here. I did not say forever. Men learn not to promise what life might test. But I let the silence that followed carry the promise anyway. Outside, the wind moved through the bare branches. The porch light hummed faintly. The house held us in a warmth that felt new even though the walls were old. That night, after Noah had gone to bed, I walked through the hallway and paused by his door. The lamp he picked cast a soft honey light across the floor. I could hear his slow breathing through the crack. A child sleeping without listening for footsteps is a kind of miracle, but it is not the kind that falls from the sky. It is the kind that people build one quiet day after another. I went downstairs and sat in the living room alone for a while, letting the silence settle the way it should, gentle, honest, unforced. I thought about the years I spent running, the miles I put between myself and grief, the way I told myself a man could outdrive his mistakes. I could not. None of us can. But maybe we can come back if we are still breathing and do one decent thing at the right time. The furnace clicked. The old house sighed in the cold. I looked toward the mantel where Sarah's photo stood, and in that stillness I felt something like her presence, not in a grand way, just in the quiet sense that a family can be broken and still find its way to light. Upstairs, a small floorboard creaked as Noah shifted in his sleep. The sound did not tighten my chest anymore, it softened it. I turned off the lamp and let the darkness come gently, the kind that makes room for morning.